we are talking about external financing needs for Pakistan. It's $128 billion over 5 years. Each year, the level of debt servicing that is required in excess of $20 billion every year, these are more than the optimistic projections of reserves. You are on a knife edge here. Every year is going to be a difficult one. जैसे इस साल हुआ है, हर साल यही सिचुएशन रिपीट होता रहेगा. रेवेन्यू आपका जो है टोटल, उसमें से almost 70%, 68% to be exact, is just interest payments. If we really decide to bite the bullet and plan for all the eventualities, and there is now so much of experience in the world to deal with defaults, it is much, much better to do it in an orderly way than to one day have it forced upon.
ख़वातीन और हज़रात, वेलकम बैक टू अनदर एपिसोड ऑफ थॉट बिहाइंड थिंग्स. जैसा कि हम रिसेंटली बहुत ज़्यादा इकोनॉमिक्स को एक्सप्लोर कर ही रहे हैं, जब मैं पाकिस्तान में किसी से बात करता हूं तो ऑडियंसेस बहुत क्विकली पार्टिजान हो जाती हैं. वो कहती हैं कि यार ये बंदा जो है ना इस पार्टी का सपोर्टर होगा या उस पार्टी का सपोर्टर होगा. तो मैंने सोचा कि क्यों ना आउटसाइड ऑफ पाकिस्तान लेट्स गेट समवन न्यूट्रल to actually look at the data and be able to give us a better sense of what the economy is going through, and potentially जो principal question that we've been focusing on recently, कि क्या पाकिस्तान का डेट सस्टेनेबल है और क्या पोटेंशियली उसको रीस्ट्रक्चरिंग की ज़रूरत है. ये कॉन्वर्जेशन अगेन माजरत ख्वाह हूँ मैं कि मेजॉरिटी इंग्लिश में होगी, बिकॉज ऑब्वियसली आवर गेस्ट इज़ नॉट फ्रॉम पाकिस्तान एंड ही इज़ based out of the US. But I think he is very well versed in Hindi, so दरमियान में mix and match थोड़ी होती रहेगी. We have with us today Dr. Sanjay Kathuria. I believe, I hope कि मैंने सही pronounce किया हो, and he is a former lead economist at the World Bank. He's worked there for 27 years, extensively covered South Asia, Caribbean, Latin America. He's worked on a lot of different developing world, so has a good sense of what works, what doesn't work. He did his master's in economics from the Delhi School of Economics, and then did his MPhil and PhD from Oxford University. Currently, I believe he is a professor at Georgetown University and a visiting professor at Ashoka University. Sir, thank you so much for being part of the show.
Thank you. बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया. और आई एम वेरी डिलाइटेड, बहुत खुश हूँ आपके शो में आने के लिए. देखा है मैंने, काफ़ी इम्प्रेस्ड हूँ आपके शो के देख के पास्ट एपिसोड्स. और एक और चीज़ मैं कहना चाहता हूँ, यूजिंग इट एज अ प्लग, वी ऑल्सो हमने अपनी एक वेबसाइट शुरू करी है, ट्रेड सेंटिनल, जिसमें वी मॉनिटर developments in all South Asian countries on a real-time basis, including Pakistan, all South Asian countries. And of course, I am also affiliated, I go a lot to Delhi, so I'm also affiliated with the Center for Social and Economic Progress.
Zabardast. So people can check out the website as well. Starting the conversation, मैं थोड़ा सा आपसे समझना चाहूँगा, क्योंकि पाकिस्तान में इकोनॉमिक्स की बहुत ज़्यादा डिबेट होती है. रिसेंटली ज़्यादा शुरू हुई है. पीपल हैव गॉटन अंडरस्टैंडिंग की डिटेल में कि हो क्या रहा है. बट थोड़ा सा बेस बनाने के लिए, क्योंकि हमारे यहाँ कभी डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग की बात होती है, कभी डिफॉल्ट की बात होती है, कभी रीप्रोफाइलिंग की बात होती है, और मोर ऑफन देन नॉट रोल ओवर की बात होती है, जिसको काफ़ी दफ़ा सेलिब्रेट भी किया जाता है. सो आई वांट टू अंडरस्टैंड व्हाट आर दीज टर्म्स, what do they mean, just as a base to our conversation?
Sure. Thank you for that's a good start. So essentially these three things. So a rollover is the sort of, in some sense, the weakest form of economy. If you on that process of debt sustainability, basically you extend your debt on the same terms as is current, right? So it's basically, you can say it's just एक 5 साल की फिर और एक 5 साल में कि आपको डेट एक्सटेंशन मिल गई. Basically,
can we say potentially that what we've done is we've taken a new debt to pay off an old debt and just paying off the interest on it?
Correct.
Right.
It's evergreening. It's another way in the banking system you would call that evergreening. Right? So it's on exactly the same terms that you have today. The good thing, of course, in rollover is that you actually get market access, because sometimes countries in a difficult debt situation, they won't get even a rollover. So it's actually not a bad thing actually to get a rollover. The next part is reprofiling, right? So there's the next level where you basically increase the maturity of the existing debt. So you don't actually have to renegotiate all the different terms. You just increase the maturity and you say maybe sometimes if your creditor is generous, you might even reduce the interest rate. So that's what we would call rescheduling or reprofiling. But the real issue today, I think we should be discussing, hopefully, is restructuring, which is basically a reduction of your debt, of your overall debt. If you compute it in net present value terms, then उसमें debt में काफी reduction होनी चाहिए, and इसको हम haircut भी बोलते हैं popularly in the parlance, in the economic parlance, debt haircut, because and it also reduces debt servicing over the years.
Right. अगर मैं आपसे पूछूं पाकिस्तानी कॉन्टेक्स्ट में, you mentioned we should be talking about debt restructuring. Why do you believe Pakistan potentially requires? And I read your article. We're going to put the link to the article for those who want to read down in the description. But you argued that even though there is an IMF program, the 25th, I suppose, that is not going to cut it out for Pakistan. Pakistan requires to go for debt restructuring, and you gave an example of Sri Lanka that has recently gone through something very similar. Run me through why you believe, in the context of Pakistan, debt restructuring may be the most viable option.
Uh, so debt restructuring essentially is most viable because the way I see Pakistan's the projections, right? So normally the IMF projections are quite optimistic, right? So we are talking about external financing needs for Pakistan, which are, counting FY24, which has recently finished, it's $128 billion over 5 years, right? These are the official IMF forecasts, right? The growth projections are also pretty optimistic. It's 3.5, 4.5, and then 5. Now, I think many would agree that these are quite optimistic. Each year, the level of debt servicing that is required in excess of $20 billion every year, these are more than the optimistic projections of reserves each year, than the optimistic. So, you are on a knife edge here every year. Every year is going to be a difficult one. जैसे इस साल हुआ है, हर साल यही सिचुएशन रिपीट होता रहेगा. आपको जाना पड़ेगा दुबई, आपको जाने पड़ेगा चाइना, आपको वॉशिंगटन ट्रिप्स लगाने. So you have to go to your creditors and well-wishers to keep doing that. So it's, at best, it will be more of the same, at best. And I am not sure that a country wants to run its economic policy on such a knife edge.
Because आप firefighting में लगे रहेंगे, तो how are you going to focus on anything in terms of growth, in terms of really, building? And for a country like Pakistan, they really have to build the foundations right now. You got a huge youth population, you got to invest in education and a lot of things. But right now, वो mostly हर government का वो यही रहता है कि किसी तरीके से loan secure कर लिया, किसी तरीके से ये कर लिया, with no real plan कि हमने long term में करना क्या है.
बिल्कुल, आप देखें ना, रेवेन्यू आपका जो है टोटल, उसमें से ऑलमोस्ट 70%, 68% टू बी एग्जैक्ट, इज जस्ट इंटरेस्ट पेमेंट्स. सो आप कहाँ से लाएंगे? वेयर आर यू गोइंग टू गेट द मनी फॉर एसेंशियल needs for an economy, for a growing economy with a growing country with population increasing? The needs are skyrocketing, but here you're saddled with just 30% of expenditure, which is outside of interest payments, 30% of your revenue.
Right. अगर मैं आपसे पूछूं, there are essentially three pathways, right? There is potentially, let's call it three pathways. There is one pathway which says that if you keep on going as you're going, you'll go towards a difficult, painful default. You're not going to be able to return the money, and at some point, someone will say, we're not going to roll over, or we're not going to give you an additional money. The alternate is you're going to keep on dragging yourself the way that you are currently dragging, the way that we've essentially currently dragged ourselves over the last 10, 15 years. And then the third potential outlook is that, some magic happens and we grow ourselves out of this nightmare. And whether that is driven by our own variables, or whether that is based on the global financial outlook, maybe interest rates get lower, maybe, money printing happens, and suddenly debt isn't worth as much. God alone knows. But if I were to ask you to project, Which do you think is more likely?
Uh, I wish I could be more optimistic about Pakistan in the current situation. I really wish the country well, the people of Pakistan really well. I have many very good friends there because when I was in the World Bank, I used to come often to Pakistan and had very, very nice and pleasant experiences there. So I have nothing but goodwill. Uh, yes, in some situation, we could see a surge in the IT sector. We could see Sialkot exports skyrocketing. We could see all that. But I'm afraid there are such systematic problems in the economy that even such, if we could have one-off surges like this, they are not going to cure, I'm afraid, the systematic problems that exist in the economy, and therefore I worry for the people of the economy, people of Pakistan, and I fear that these problems will not go away, and
So
and the fact that
let's say you've reduced the potential of, let's say, growing out of it, but between dragging yourself on the same versus, let's say, a hard default, which one would you think would be more likely based on the numbers? And I'll give you context for that. Pakistan, unfortunately, because of politics, because of a lot of things, we've made default and restructuring a dirty word, and so it's the biggest nightmare. Everybody, there's obviously it's whoever does it, जिसके भी टेन्योर में होगा, politically बड़ा damaging है, nobody wants to do it, they want to push it to the next person, and so ये कॉन्वर्जेशन भी नहीं होती, हालांकि थियोरेटिकली कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं है, आप एक इशू को आइडेंटिफाई कर रहे हैं और आप कह रहे हैं कि यू नो व्हाट, लेट्स figure it out, let's create a plan, let's get out of it. And a lot of people in Pakistan also don't know that we've actually done a restructuring in early 2000s, and इतना कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं हुआ था. But just again, to understand the gravity of situation, do you think कि, क्योंकि गवर्नमेंट का तो यही है कि वो शायद probably इसको ड्रैग आउट करेगी, डू यू थिंक कि ड्रैग आउट का ज़्यादा चांस है, ठीक है कुछ ना कुछ करके ड्रैग आउट होता रहेगा, या डू यू थिंक कि इन इट्स इवेंचुअलिटी कहीं ना वो इतना बड़ा नंबर हो जाएगा, वो इंटरेस्ट रैक कर 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 के हार्ड डिफॉल्ट ही करना पड़ेगा? अगर आप अपना एक डिजिटल पर्सनल ब्रांड बनाना चाहते हैं तो मैं अपनी डिजिटल मीडिया मास्टर क्लास लॉन्च कर रहा हूं, जहां पर मैं आपको डिजिटल मीडिया और इन्फ्लुएंसर मार्केटिंग के फंडामेंटल्स सिखाऊंगा in a 2-month long live bootcamp where I will be summarizing 14 years of my experience in the field. If you're interested, you can sign up with your email on the link down below. See you there.
आई थिंक सो. आपका फर्स्ट पार्ट आपका क्वेश्चन था कि ये सब डरते हैं क्योंकि इसके इफेक्ट्स अनप्रिडिक्टेबल है, राइट? सो यस, तो मैं कहूँगा कि ट्रेड ऑफ तो होता ही है इकोनॉमिक. दैट इज व्हाट इकोनॉमिक पॉलिसी मेकिंग इज अबाउट, राइट? एज इकोनॉमिस्ट वी से there is no free lunch, right? There is no such thing as a free lunch. Everything has a trade-off. But you have to, so let's talk about the population, right? What will be the net effect on the population? My submission is that if you actually don't plan for it, then the eventuality will take place, but in a disorderly way. A default is much worse than a planned restructuring. Right? And why do I say this? So, for example, look at the situation currently. Last over 2 years, right? 2.5 years, more than that, we have been seeing skyrocketing prices, some of the highest energy retail prices in the world, right? You have seen riots and protests in the Pakistan side of Kashmir over very high prices, shrinking real incomes amongst everybody, right? So, this is the current situation in the as is business as usual scenario, and yes, inflation has come down recently. I saw a news article today; it's come down into single digits. Very good, and I'm glad. But this is not something that is predictable. It can go up again, and I think if you do it systematically. Right, a planned default, a planned restructuring, a planned default is much better, because when you come out of it, right, because you have taken steps, you have your debt servicing will go down, you would be able to have more discretionary expenditure and do the things that will set you on the path of long-term growth. you have to be so worried that you don't want to contemplate something? Well, you don't have far to look, right? Look at Sri Lanka. It defaulted in April 2022. And what has happened after the default? It has had 3 consecutive quarters of positive real GDP growth. It has declined inflation. It has built up its reserves. And it is, the program is going. Now, there is a new government, so we'll have to wait and watch what happens with the program. But as far as the orderly default is concerned, it was managed well with the IMF support. And the economy is looking much better for having done it.
Do you think in terms of Sri Lanka, was it something that the government decided, okay, the numbers don't look good, let's go for a default and start that conversation? Or again, was it a hard default for them? We know that there was a political crisis. There was a lot happening at the time in Sri Lanka. And for a few months, we heard, there's no paper, there's no fuel. It's very difficult. So I also want to understand, first of all, with Sri Lanka, what was the real on ground situation that led to the default? Was it something that they preempted, or was it something that they had to do? And secondly, w- generally in let's say a planned sort of restructuring situation, what impact do you think happens to the ordinary Pakistani, let's say? Because my understanding is the average majority that is lower middle income, they're mostly dealing with the local produced food, local produced textile. And so it's mostly the upper middle and above that are very heavily reliant on imported stuff, that have to really go through most of the pain, at least right now when most of your food is locally produced. And so I feel like the fear mongering is also, in a way, not very well warranted, because it's your elite really trying to protect their own interests and trying to tell the masses it's going to be bad when it's not really. So I just want to understand what happens, in such a situation.
Right. Yeah, no, very, very, very suitable, very opposite questions. So Sri Lanka's situation was that so many things you will find, similar. As I recall the situation in Sri Lanka, there was an infrastructure binge that happened starting 2005 when Mahinda Rajapaksa came to power, and that accelerated after the end of the civil war in 2009. Uh, so debt started accumulating rapidly, especially external debt. Uh, Export growth was poor. Uh, there was an unprecedented decline in the trade to GDP ratio, which is terrible for a small economy. I think that trade to GDP ratio fell from 89% to about 49% or so. So 40 percentage point decline in the trade because of erection of trade barriers starting in the early 2000s, right? So the reserves started dwindling because they had to start making all these external payments, and resulted in rising inflation, rationing of food, fuel, and even medicines started getting rationed. Eventually, the reserves became so low that the policies makers had to make a choice between paying external creditors, or do you allow your poor people, or general population, but especially the poor, do you allow them to consume food? Do you allow them to get medicines and fuel for transport? And I think the policymakers decided that it was best that they spend their very scarce foreign exchange reserves on their people and not to pay off external creditors. So they did a default in April 2022. Now, I think it's a very important question that you ask. The second part of your question is the local produce issue. Now, I think Pakistan is in a much better situation compared to Sri Lanka when it comes to local sufficiency, self-sufficiency. आप अपने खुद उगाते हैं, आपके agriculture, mashallah, is quite it's a wide and varied. You grow a lot of things yourself, unlike Sri Lanka, right? Sri Lanka also grows, but it is more limited. It's very strong in horticulture, but you have a wide range of agriculture production. So you're absolutely right that in that kind of situation, it is more of a elite goods scenario that will get affected, rather than those that are affecting the domestic population. As long as you take care of some fundamental things like the savings of poor people, they should not vanish, right? So you need to protect those. You need to guard against, if there is a huge increase in inflation, you can guard against that in a preemptive way. Right? And Pakistan has a good cash support, Benazir income support program, and all of that. That can be increased. It is done through IT technology. So I think that can be buffered, increased still further, and so on. So I think if we really decide to bite the bullet and plan for all the eventualities, and there is now so much of experience in the world to deal with defaults, it is much, much better to do it in an orderly way than to one day have it forced upon you.
Makes sense. You mentioned the infrastructure development in Sri Lanka. Again, both Sri Lanka and Pakistan had a similar situation where they were participants of the One Belt, One Road and got a lot of investment from China, and that really increased their sort of overall debt number. Pakistan is facing a similar situation right now, particularly in the power sector, where there's 16-17 billion dollars of Chinese debt essentially in the power sector that they have to return. And so right now, the average unit cost of power is almost 3 to 4 times what is the average in the region. In Bangladesh, for example, if you're getting an average unit for 17 rupees, in Pakistan you're getting that for 65 to 70. And so it almost makes it impossible for you to even grow out with our first scenario, right? To actually grow out of the problem, if the core energy is 3 to 4 times more expensive, it suddenly creates everything becomes more expensive. And so there is that problem as well, where you may have to go and talk to China for reprofiling of that debt or restructuring of that debt. I want to understand two things. I know that there is a geopolitical situation here as well. There's a lot of polarization globally, and so there's going to be a ping pong, and we've seen that with the IMF program, where they've in a lot of ways intentionally tried to poke China and said, okay, no more special economic zones. Go talk to China first, and then we'll give you the money. And so we're sort of stuck there in the middle between two giants, playing their own, geopolitical situation. And so, if we are to go towards a restructuring, looking at China's example, how do we ping pong between these two? Because if they're just sort of going to drag us out, that is going to be very painful for the local population.
Right. Well, again, Sri Lanka has exactly this in terms of geopolitics. They face the same thing, right? China is the biggest bilateral creditor in Sri Lanka, and it is managing. It is after a lot of difficulty, it has managed to secure a deal. Although the terms of that deal with China are not clear, they have not been put out, but at least the past president stated that they had a deal. Now, China's is, of course, very difficult to deal with when it comes to debt. Right? The world knows that, right? They're the biggest, single biggest bilateral creditor in the world, and so it has, maybe $1 trillion of debt in different countries or more, and its debt dealings are not transparent. But it is, unlike other countries in South Asia, it is the single most steadfast supporter of Pakistan, right? So I think Pakistan has to tell China, look, you have to come on board. Let's presume that we are going with a restructuring situation. You have to come the extra mile, because you are our best supporter, our biggest supporter. Without your support, a debt restructuring will not happen, right? Nobody, the Western world, the Paris Club, the IMF, will not allow us to go in for a debt restructuring and a proper haircut, which is required for debt sustainability. So you, China, have to come on board and be as transparent as is possible. I mean, I'm caricaturing, of course. This has to be put in diplomatic speak.
Right.
But I'm saying, in effect, Pakistan has to really insist and plead with China to come on board in a full-throated way, so that this restructuring can actually be enabled.
And we've seen this happen already in Sri Lanka's case. Like they were able
Uh,
to talk to both parties and were able to get their restructuring through.
there were assurances. Sri Lanka the IMF went through with the program based on assurances. After the program started, the actual deal was worked out after the program started, but a deal was struck
Right.
with China and separately with the Paris Club, right? Where the two biggest creditors, and with India. India is not a formal member of the Paris Club, but it adheres to Paris Club terms. And India and Japan, I believe, were co-chairs of the debt roundtable for Sri Lanka. China, Sri Lanka had to negotiate separately with China, but it did that. And so I
Something
think if
was
Sri
forced.
Lanka
Right.
can do it, so can Pakistan.
Right. I want to also understand because there is this confusion. We when this sort of CPEC deals were coming in, and a lot of the money was put into power production. Again, 16, $17 billion that has to be returned within 10 years. So the payments have already started. A lot of these plants went live anywhere between 2018 to 2022, and so as soon as they started going live, they were basically they had to be returned in within 10 years. Um, these are sort of commercial projects for जिसके लिए essentially आपने debt लिया हुआ है, right? एंड इस पे पाकिस्तान में ये बड़ा एक बेसिक चीज़ कही जाती है कि इस पे सॉवरेन गारंटी है कि ये डेट निकलेगा ही निकलेगा, गवर्नमेंट इंश्योर करेगी कि वो डेट निकलेगा ही निकलेगा। एंड द रीज़न व्हाई देयर इज़ अ लॉट ऑफ कन्फ्यूजन इज़ कि द लास्ट टाइम जब एक कमर्शियल डील के ऊपर वी यू नो वेंट अवे फ्रॉम दैट, तो वो रिकोडेक की एक माइन थी बलूचिस्तान में, जिसके ऊपर फिर इवेंचुअली इंटरनेशनल कोर्ट में चली गई दूसरी पार्टी, एंड दे हैड टू impose fines of billions of dollars, and then we had to really go through an entire cycle of renegotiation and cost us a lot. जब ये डेट रिस्ट्रक्चरिंग की बात हो रही है, तो इसमें क्या मतलब आई एम ट्राइंग टू अंडरस्टैंड, अगेन आई एम नॉट एन इकोनॉमिस्ट। एक आपका डेट है जो गवर्नमेंट टू गवर्नमेंट आप या मल्टीलैटरल टू गवर्नमेंट आप ले रहे हैं और आप कह रहे हैं कि भाई मुझे डेट चाहिए, मैं इसके साथ जो भी करता हूँ विल फिगर दैट आउट। एक आपकी कमर्शियल डील्स के अंदर डेट लगा हुआ है। एसेंशियली प्राइवेट एंटिटीज हैं जिन्होंने अपने प्रोजेक्ट्स को फंड किया है थ्रू डेट, जिसमें गवर्नमेंट ने सॉवरेन गारंटी दी हुई है। Can this debt also be restructured? Can that conversation also be done? Or is it like कि बस वो लीगल डॉक्यूमेंट साइंड है, सॉवरेन गारंटी है, तो आप पूरी जिंदगी इसको टच ही नहीं कर सकते?
सो देखिए, जो गवर्नमेंट की ऑफिशियल डेट है, वो भी गारंटीड डेट है। आई मीन, बाय डेफिनेशन, राइट?
राइट।
वो तो फॉर्मल गवर्नमेंट डेट है। दिस इज de facto kind of government debt because it has a sovereign guarantee. But if you can renegotiate government debt, there is no reason why you can't renegotiate private debt. But it will be done separately. It could be done. Like Sri Lanka again has been talking to the private bondholders. It has actually quite a lot of private bondholder debt, and they have also, I understand, they are coming on board with, because unless they come on board, we won't achieve the sufficient degree of haircut, right? Now, so if even if something is called private, nobody comes and invests these large sums of money without guarantees, right? And that is why prudent fiscal calculations always include such debt in overall government debt calculations. But yeah, I mean, the bondholders or the private debt holders have to come on the table just like the other debt
So it can
holders.
very well be done. There's no legal sort of, you're not stuck forever and now you have to, it's
No,
not loan sharks essentially after
no,
you.
because you're negotiating with the very same people whom you have signed the contract with, and they are willing to say, okay, it is force majeure. We know you are in a very difficult situation, so it is a negotiation, right?
Right.
It is a contractual renegotiation. Uh, if of course, if they want, they can enforce the terms of the contract, but then they won't get their money. This way, at least, they can get some part of their money back. That's what brings them to the table. They know that if they don't come to the table, they may get nothing or they may get very little. This way, they might get 60 cents on the dollar instead of 20 cents on the dollar. So
Right.
that's the calculation they make when they come to the table.
Right. And on average, I mean, when you're talking about debt restructuring and haircuts particularly, are we looking at like what happens? Are we looking at interest being waived off? Are we looking at actually the the principal getting waived off? Is it dependent on the situation? How does that work?
Yeah, I think so many different ways of doing it, but eventually you do have to come about at the end of the day significant reduction in interest. Usually it does require, if you're going to achieve a reduction in the present value of debt, right, it normally requires some reduction in the principal as well, right, unless you extend the maturity so far out with very low interest that then the present value comes down very significantly. So ultimately, this is a spreadsheet calculation. You can try different permutations and combinations with a smaller reduction in principal and a much heavier reduction and extension of maturities to, from say 5 years to 20 years. That brings down your value. Or you say, okay, let's just be done with it. Let's just reduce the principal, right? So you have to have an end target. Key, what do I want my debt to GDP ratio to look like? Right. And then I can play around with different combinations of principal and interest.
Makes sense. I believe you mentioned in the article that you didn't just focus on the external debt. You also said, the local debt needs to be restructured, and we're looking at, again, 68% of the government revenue going into,
by definition, right?
debt repayments and
both
interest.
formal government debt. This is
a lot
de
of
facto
the banking sector
kind of government debt
really,
because it has a
in
sovereign
a lazy
guarantee.
way, just takes the capital and just lends it to the
if
government.
you can renegotiate government
a lot
debt,
of analysts,
there is
as a
no
counter
reason
to that,
why
they
you
say,
can't
right now there's a
renegotiate
high
private
interest rate
debt. But
environment.
it will
As
be
the
done
interest rates fall,
separately.
those
It could be done. Like Sri Lanka again has been talking to the private bondholders. It has actually quite a lot of
look into
a bondholder, private
restructuring, that is going
bondholder
to
debt,
devastate your banking
and
industry,
they have also,
and will collapse the whole
I
system.
understand, they are coming on board.
When you're looking at the
Because
Pakistani banking
unless
system
they
as
come
well
on
as the
board,
local debt,
we
how
won't
do
get
you
achieve
suggest
this.
can the restructuring be done in a way that does not, again, destroy or usher chaos in the entire system?
Right. No, that's a very important question. So the good thing is, based on what you just said about, that they buy government debt, high interest rate. So actually, the banking system is quite profitable, right? It's highly profitable, according to the IMF's last report. And therefore, I think it has some cushion there. It has some room to take a haircut. I think a deal can be worked out. Obviously, again, the government has to sit down with all different kinds of creditors, right? And in this case, the domestic debt is higher than external debt. So it is important. But, external debt is always the bigger problem because you can't print dollars to pay back, right? You can print, you can have inflation, you can have domestic rupee printing and all of that. Not that that's a great idea. But domestic debt is easier in many ways from a macro point of view. It is easier to handle than external debt. I believe that a deal can be worked out in Sri Lanka, although its problem was mostly external debt, but it also had a domestic debt restructuring component in there, right? One of the countries that I worked with, Jamaica, many years ago, they did. I believe Pakistan can look to Jamaica. They have worked a domestic exchange program. Most of their debt actually was held by domestic banks. So they worked out a reduction in coupons, interest payments, and so on, with the domestic banking sector without affecting its credibility. They, in fact, came out of when I was working on Jamaica, they had in 2000 onwards, they had just recovering from a massive financial crisis and so on. But starting 2012, 2013, they went in for this domestic debt exchange with the banking system. So what I'm trying to say is, with proper will, this kind of thing can be managed without disruption, right? It can be. Again, look at the alternative. You can have disruption, right? In the event of a default, all holders will get affected. So the counterfactual is that even the domestic banking sector will get disrupted. The poor savings account, there could be runs on banks, and all kinds of things could be happening. Alternative is do it properly, make them sit across the table and say, okay, how much haircut are you willing to give me? How much am I willing to give you? All of that, So that's a negotiation. So they are part of the overall deal. I think it can be managed.
Makes sense. You mentioned the IMF projections to be very optimistic, and this is something that was echoed by the, one of the former governors of the state bank as well, where he said it doesn't. It's mind-boggling, how IMF believes we might be able to get the numbers that they think we might get to get out of this, right? So in terms of growth, in terms of tax collection, we've gotten a shortfall of tax collection this time as well, and that is on the back of massive tax increases. And so what in your opinion is the reason why IMF was not able to sort of A, project, and B, push for a restructuring right now? Because my understanding is, I mean, it would have made more sense for them to be, rather than just saying, okay, just इन लैक फॉर अ लैक ऑफ बेटर वर्ड, उन्होंने ना वो निचोड़ दिया कि यार जो जो है ना उसको निचोड़ो, और निचोड़ के जो निकाल सकते हो निकाल दो. And so, the government is celebrating. They're saying the numbers are coming down, the inflation is down, everything is very stable. But really, if you go on ground, joblessness is just on a massive scale. Buying power has just completely eroded. Economy is basically massively slowed down. And so, it's not really the solution. You haven't gotten a stable economy that is ready for growth. You've basically gotten an economy that's just not working. And so, with all of its experience, and particularly its own experience with Pakistan 24 times before, I would have thought they would be more forward with this idea that, make okay, Pakistan, it seems like you're unable to figure yourself out. Let's start talking about a restructuring, and see where that takes us.
Yeah. No, I think so. At the end of the day, the IMF and the World Bank are sort of, they're global cooperative public sector institutions, right? So, in some sense, they can only suggest. It is ultimately a country's decision. So these institutions, both all the multilateral, have to be politically correct. They can explain the scenarios privately. I'm not privy to the discussions, लेकिन मुझे लगता है प्राइवेटली उन्होंने बताया होगा कि अगर आप ऐसे करेंगे तो ऐसे होगा, राइट? Explaining upside, downsides, they would have explained. But at the end, it is very much of a country sovereign decision. And for the reasons that we have already talked about, the government, at least so far, seems to have decided and seems to have stuck to its guns that it will not restructure.
Right. Assuming that we do end up in a restructuring situation, let's say in the next couple of years, we've had a restructuring before as well, and so the fear is we'll restructure, and then 10 years from now we'll be in the same place. And so I'm trying to understand. We've done this in early 2000s. We had a good run for a few years. We had a war on terror going on as well. There's a lot of aid money coming into Pakistan, and so government. The Pakistani government basically they controlled the dollar. They didn't really open up the economy as they should have. They didn't really reform the economy as they should have. And so, how does, if I were to ask you, can you potentially suggest, based on your understanding of the Pakistani economy, some reforms? Because just restructuring is just going to give you some space. Let's say if you're looking at 1-2 years of sustenance right now with an IMF program, maybe restructuring might give you 10 years. But it's not really the solution unless tied with certain reforms that will put you on a path of long-term growth. What would those, and this is something that whenever I speak to a thought leader in Pakistan, or a business leader, or an economist, they're always talking about, we need structural changes. It's unfortunate that I've never been able to, in 430 conversations, I've never been able to identify what that structure is that needs to be changed. And so I'd like to get your input as an outsider. What potential reforms can Pakistan take, followed by the restructuring?
Sure. Very important question. Before I answer that precise question, let me also say that we should not only pick up the Sri Lankan example. There is a World Bank study which I have quoted in my essay. There were 177 sovereign external and domestic defaults. That after successful defaults, the governments had reduced the debt to GDP ratio somewhere between 24 to 34 percentage points 5 years after the correction. Right? So there is hope. There is macro data. There is showing it's not easy, but there is hope. Okay. Now coming back to your very, very important question. क्या पाकिस्तान को क्या करना चाहिए, right? So restructuring is obviously just a start of the program. The hope is that the crisis that restructuring represents, right? There is what could be a bigger crisis than debt restructuring, you defaulting on a contract, right? So this is a crisis situation. The hope is that crisis allows fundamental reforms, right? That is what I very much hope that it will, and it should, the country should, policymakers should sit up. So I have 4 or 5 things that I talk about a lot. I've written quite a lot about this, about Pakistan as well. So the first thing is that introduce competition in the economy. Allow your youngsters to contribute to the economy as enabled in India, to a lesser extent Bangladesh, which means reducing these high protection walls against importers, domestic producers. This is a bias against exporters. Basically, import tariff is nothing but what we call an anti-export bias, because the 2 things happen. You get a wall of tariffs, so you're comfortable, produce high profitability production for the domestic market. Secondly, your input prices go up, right? So your export production becomes expensive. So reducing tariffs, rationalizing tariffs, which will help to reduce this anti-export bias. Another element of reducing, I'm still on that first bucket of increasing competition, leveling the playing fields, which means all these state-owned enterprises who get undue subsidies, favors, and they basically suck out resources from the economy, level the playing field, right? Put them on a path to profitability. If they can't, then you have to put them on the market, right? India has had done that with Air India, right? So there are many examples even, in the region, right? So that's the first bucket, is introduce competition in the economy in different ways. Second, of course, and this is very much a part of the IMF program, is increase the tax base, right? And tax collections overall. Tax people who are wealthy, tax them, right? So high value agriculture should be taxed and so on. And broaden the tax base, right? So that this will allow, so it cannot be simply a reduction of spending will not cut it, because tax collections are 11% of GDP. That's simply unsustainable, right? So you have to increase the tax base. Again, it gets back to addressing those this whole, what many people have called in Pakistan the moneyed elite, or the 1% economy, as your former finance minister called it. So I think they have to come on board when it comes to increasing the tax base, right? Otherwise, it will not be successful. Third part is leave economic policy to economic policy makers, right? It should not be done by others who have much less understanding of the economy, right? Talking about, that there is a lot of the army is entrenched in economics. There are Fauji Foundation, real estate, in logistics, and so on. I think economists understand the economy, and they should be running the economy. The fourth thing is fixing public expenditure management. Right? Very important throughout the region. We saw it in Sri Lanka. We're seeing in Pakistan this entire debt of CPEC, including, now you mentioned the power sector, was all of it done guaranteeing strong social returns, positive and strong social returns, or was it done as pet projects of leaders? Right? Did they have, so public expenditure management, fundamental ABC of that has to be put in place so that future projects do not come up like this, which have negative or very low social or economic rates of return. And the final thing I would say here is that fix your economics with India, right? This is something I feel very passionate about. Again, I've written a lot about this. India is the largest, fastest growing large economy in the world. How can you afford to be shorn of economic engagement with this dynamic powerhouse which imports $700 billion worth of goods and almost $900 billion worth of goods and services? Right? If you just exporting to potential, Pakistan's exports would go up by 80% to India. And then not to mention that the prices, all this inflation that you've had, energy prices, there was a deal almost happened to export energy from India to Pakistan. It fell through. But all of these things should get fixed. You have to ride on the coattails of India to improve your economy. Otherwise, it is, as I also wrote in my foreign policy piece, it is Pakistan's biggest missing market. Right? So these are a bunch of some not easy to do, but I feel all these are fundamental to Pakistan coming back to sustainable and inclusive growth.
Makes sense. I want to understand moving a little bit away from current Pakistani crisis. I want to go back in history, particularly in 1991 with India when they actually took out their reforms. And in 1998, when the Asian financial crisis essentially pushed a lot of Far East Asian countries to restructure the way that they run the economy, not necessarily their debt. I want to first of all understand correlations between these crises that they faced and the crisis that Pakistan has faced. Again, while Pakistan has had its own set of problems, there was a global situation as well. There are a lot of countries that have been going through economic crisis recently. And so if you were to compare these two situations, again, with India, back in the day, it was a closed off economy. They did not have a lot of dollars left again for imports, and so they had to really think about how to now move forward. How would you compare both, and what were some of the reforms that really worked for India that allowed for them to never go back to IMF?
Right. Again, very important. So we, as economists, we say that crisis breeds reform, right? And so we often say, use the crisis, right? So, okay, nobody wishes a crisis upon you. But if you have it, then for economists, use the opportunity, because then you can get things done which you normally may not, but you would have lots of vested interests blocking fundamental reforms. But in that situation, you will have a lot of people supporting you, especially the general population. So the societal support for fixing, because maybe in some ways you hurt the country very badly, that you have allowed yourself to get into this crisis. So at that point of time, there is much more widespread support for doing things which you otherwise may not be able to do. So both these examples you gave are very important, the 1991 and 1997-98 Asian crisis. It is interesting that this was the last time these countries went to the IMF. India, 91, East Asian countries, 98. That was it, right? Because what they did is they began to crisis-proof their countries, right? So one of the biggest things that happened is reserve accumulation, right? So because as I said earlier, external debt is a big problem, right? So you want to make sure that you never have the problem of external debt. So they have been, East Asia, India, many countries have been accumulating insane amount of reserves, right? So you never have to put yourself in the situation that you have to go back to the IMF, and so others say, and compromise your country's sovereignty and all of these things. People often say. So what did India do, right? So India today has close to $700 billion of reserves, right? The good thing is that often they say these were reforms imposed by the IMF and the World Bank in 91. Actually, the truth is different. That India had been seeing, there were far-thinking economists in India who had already been thinking about these reforms for quite a while. Right? There was a core team out there, and they developed them. My current colleague in CSIP, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, he created something. He wrote up something called the M document, and which was formed the basis of many of the reforms. There was very broad societal consensus. Mr. Narasimha Rao, who was the prime minister, was a consensus builder, right? So he was able to actually paradoxically, through consensus, take some hard decisions that, again, a tougher person perhaps may not have been able to do, because he was consensus builder, right? So India fixed some of its most ridiculous economic policies, the license Raj, industrial licensing, which I think was the extent of it was almost unique in the world, to the extent that we had to, to go to the bathroom, the industrialists had to take permission. I'm caricaturing, but that's what they had to take permission for everything, right? So they got rid of that license Raj regime, and then they started reforming the exchange rate, and reduced tariffs dramatically from an excess of 100% to very significant tariff reduction. So that was round one, and then it was followed up with second round of reforms with banking and more fundamental things, that institutional set of.
What I'm trying to understand is, were these reforms extremely radical, or was it that the pain? I mean, was the pain because of the reforms, or the pain because the situation was so bad that the pain came in, and because the pain had already come in, the reforms followed? Because again, a lot of the reforms that we look at it in Pakistan right now, when it's business as usual, they're so painful, at least for the elite and those who are connected to the elite, that it's something that, when you're looking at it from a political economy standpoint, it almost becomes impossible that that's going to happen, right? Because it's not something that can be just easily be done without ruffling a lot of feathers. And so I'm trying to understand, were these sort of radical reforms where they came in and they said, listen, we have to do it, doesn't matter what that's going to do politically, doesn't matter if people agitate, we have to do what we have to do?
Yeah. So so remember, we are now talking of a crisis has already happened, right? You had to sell gold, put your gold in the Bank of England, physically fly the gold to the Bank of England. That was the erosion of credibility of the Indian monetary system, in that you have to do that. So the fiscal deficit had skyrocketed. So the pain was already there. It was reflected, in the economy, in the macroeconomy. So the pain was already there. So from the pain, and it hurt Indian, their economic self-belief, the fact that, you were supposed to be the largest democratic and, country in the world with a strong economy. But because in the mid-80s onwards, the economy had started to do better. They had some gradual, licensing or deregulation had started in a small way. So it hurt India to the quick, right? And gave that political space actually for the reforms, right? And a consensus builder then managed to pull that through with very wide consensus from all strands of society. I think the difference in Pakistan is Pakistan has felt this pain so many times, right? And it is yet so 24 times, 25 times to the IMF. It has not been able to use the opportunity of the crisis, because I think of the stranglehold of, as you said, the stranglehold of the people who currently either manage or influence the economy. It can influence the policymakers. And it is not allowing the classic crisis drive reform scenario to take place. It would be so easy to actually, in some sense, it's a dream for an economist to think economic reforms because there is much less constraint in a crisis situation, right? Because political space is much more. I think if the current crisis is to be properly utilized, then I think this has to be a more, let's say, inclusive, more consultative reform process, co-opting wide swaths of the country, going outside the elite, right? Going to the provinces and saying, consulting and then preparing a blueprint for reforms, which takes into account what people need, right? And how then you get, they are not economists, but they can tell you what they need. So then the economists can figure out what is needed to get to those kinds of outcomes. So elite capture has to go away. Otherwise, then they won't allow, elite will not allow uh, the reforms that are needed from a long-term sustainability perspective.
Makes sense. Eh, When I look at elite capture, this is not a uniquely Pakistan problem. I mean, Asia by and large, most of the countries, when I've been studying a lot of these countries, I saw again very sort of slow growth, a lot of these problems, a lot of rent seeking, a lot of corruption, and then you then see a crisis, and then a hockey stick growth where the countries essentially begin to reform themselves. And so, um, if I were to just look at it in a very simple lens, a country essentially like a business can keep on hacking the economy, can keep that control, but if it's inefficient, at some point in time nature is going to creatively destruct the economy and going to start to focus towards efficiency, right? In Pakistan's case, we had that opportunity in the 50s, in the 70s, in the late 90s as well. But every single time, there was a every time the crisis emerged in terms of the politics because of the economy, you had the military take over, and more often than not, Americans plugging in a lot of money for one reason or the other. Initially, development, eventually, in a couple of wars and military aid. And so you were able to get a semblance of prosperity that really confused the audience, where they don't, for a lot of people in India, like, for example, I'm sure the crisis must have existed multiple times in the past. And then there was this one point where the crisis was now so big that it was almost impossible to sustain it or to kick the can down the road because the can has become so heavy. And so when I was looking at a lot of these countries, Indonesia is a very similar example, very similar to Pakistan. You had a military regime, military had a lot of control over the economy. They were there for 30 years. There was a lot of rent seeking, big population. Again, there was this one moment that where it almost became impossible. So a lot of times in Pakistan, people are like, oh, we're uniquely positioned where our elite are special, and they just they want to make sure that we don't grow, when it's actually human nature. If you have a good thing going and it's complicated to change it, you're not going to do it, right? And so we've seen that across the region. What I want to understand is there a scale beyond which nature doesn't allow? And my thesis for Pakistan is, and actually India was around 350 billion dollar economy, Indonesia was around the similar number, Turkey was around a similar number when you actually see the hockey stick, right? And so there is a certain point where the economy becomes so large that the hacks that governments historically use, where they plug in some money from a foreign country, or they control the dollar, or they show you a semblance of prosperity. I feel like for a country like Pakistan, we've now begun to pass that phase where, like you mentioned early on, to sustain it in a way that the population can feel like, oh, it's all business as usual, things are working fine, it's increasingly impossible. And it seems more likely that a default will be an inevitability, um, followed by a lot of political and social instability.
Yeah. No, I think so. This is the fundamental issue, right? So the elite capture is there. It manifests itself in different ways. Perhaps Pakistan is unique in terms of the number of times it's had crises, and therefore the number of times it's had to go to the IMF. I think Sri Lanka has been 17 times, so they've had their fair share of crises. And I would say in the region, uh, the closest in terms of elite capture that I would say to Pakistan, but different orders. One is Sri Lanka and one is Bangladesh. Right? They've had different degrees of elite capture as well. But uh, certainly in Bangladesh, they managed to combine that with some strong, good common sense economics, right? So to enable the country to grow. And I remember that when I presented the Bangladesh story in Pakistan, there were lots of people who sat up and said, it's amazing how, they've exceeded now Pakistan in exports. They're a bigger economy. And I'm sure there are many people who still can't get over that, can't believe that, Bangladesh is a richer country today, both per capita and despite being a much smaller country, its GDP is now larger than Pakistan's. Right? So the uh, I think the economies in Indonesia, you gave an example, they have managed to use their bad periods, right? In a way, yes, I'm not saying there is no elite capture. There is certainly, it exists in India, Indonesia, there are, but it's a different orders of magnitude, right? Here, I think in Pakistan, it is so deeply entrenched, and there is an alliance, right, between different sections of elites who are all powerful. Therefore, it does not allow sort of the groundswell or the public opinion to sway that, and so perhaps public opinion doesn't get reflected, and maybe it is not even canvassed uh, in economic policy making, and it doesn't get its fair hearing. Um, and as you said, it is easy because people's memory are very short. Every time there is a crisis, you get some benefactor comes and bails you out, including the IMF. Then the US comes in, China comes in, and then for a while you have a period of calm. For a while, till the next. So people are confused. You tell them a story, tell them a spin, and they say, okay, we are now on a good track. So chalo bhaiya, let's continue our work. हम अपना काम करते हैं, उनको अपना काम करने दो, हम अपना काम करते हैं. But we know this is confusing because it's a very short-term view. Uh, as I said, it is not being run on the basis of strong economic fundamentals. The economy is very much tilted towards a very narrow section of, all those reforms that I pointed out. There are different vested interests against each of those different kinds of reforms. Uh, how do you get that is the $1 million question. Bangladesh has an amazing example, right? The Bangladesh of August has an amazing example for the rest of the world, and especially for us in South Asia and for Pakistan. It was a student revolution, a people's revolution, and there is hope that all the governance issues, many of those which mimic Pakistan, especially the elite capture part, though not as fundamental, as deep seated as in Pakistan, but there is certainly elite capture, and they want to get rid of that completely, that kind of elite capture in Bangladesh. So if we're going down to the root causes, one is to say that there is elite capture and economic policy making. How do you address that? That is political economy issue, right? So that's beyond my
Of course, I understand.
expertise.
I understand.
But I certainly can. I think Bangladesh is a fantastic example of a grassroots revolution.
Makes sense. I think
Hopefully,
one of the
we'll
reasons
get
why,
it result.
of course,
Correct.
I think one of the reasons why I had that question, a lot of people in Pakistan have that question, is because people are tired of waiting for that smart leader or those smart leaders who will sit down together and be able to bring that reforms. And so they're trying to project whether through chaos theory, beyond a human being coming in and solving this, can nature bring us to a point where concessions become inevitable by the elite rather than someone taking out and being the bigger man or bigger person. I want to wrap this up. We're at the 1 hour 2 minute mark, but I want to understand India's 91 example now increasingly is quoted a lot in Pakistan, and it's considered as as this Manmohan Singh Saab came in and he brought these reforms and that put India on a trajectory of growth. And today it's all about India. The media and the news is all about India. It's the next rising power, and there's definitely a lot to learn. But alternatively, while for a country like Pakistan that's really building its framework right now, for a lot of young people and a lot of viewers on this channel as well, they're really beginning to build that framework for the first time of what the structure should be and what the narrative should be when it comes to really arguing about or debating about the economic policy. I would definitely look at India in 92 and then China in 92 and then see that growth and then identify that there is that growth has been not very equitable, right? And so you've seen massive amount of wealth, a wedding done with $300 million spent on that, and then you see a lot of poverty there as well. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail in terms of grassroots individual factors, but I want to get a sense, what we understand is, again, and this is not a very educated understanding of India's economy. It was a socialist sort of closed off economy, and then they embraced capitalism and free markets and neoliberal reforms, and they've grown so much. But in a lot of ways, as an outsider, it also seems like a lot of that capitalism and that neoliberal reforms created or radically increased inequality. And for me, that would be a very big question mark of whether we should be looking at the same similar reforms as India, just to get the macro number out there, but with not a lot of people or a lot of our poor population get out of poverty, if that makes sense.
Right, right. No, I think it's a very important question. But I would, what I would say, a few things. One is that worry less about the inequality than about absolute poverty, right? So,
Mhm.
you have, if the economy is growing, right, then no matter what the level of it, as long as the poor are getting, an increase in their income, in their real income, after adjusting for inflation, then that, in that sense, that's a better scenario than the previous one,
Right. So
right?
you're basically saying
So
if the
growing,
poorest of the poor has the basics sorted out and their education is sorted out, food, housing is sorted out, it doesn't really
yeah,
matter what the richest of your rich is
yeah.
doing.
I mean, it matters in some sense, in a moral sense. It matters in a way that at something it has a demonstration effect, and it matters because it leads to cronyism, right?
Right.
And they start
And that's
controlling.
probably
So
why. So cronyism is the reason why I asked this question. Now, How do
yeah,
you how do you ensure that while you're doing free market, you don't end up in a crony situation?
yeah. So it's a tough thing to manage. I would say that you manage cronyism. The best way to do it is through competition. Let loose competition. India is one of the most dynamic venture capital markets in the world, right? A number of new companies, unicorns that are coming up. The fastest growing companies now in India are the medium and small scale. What somebody, Saurabh Mukherjee, I think, has called the challengers.
Right.
Uh, uh, so they are the fastest growing segments of India's economy today, right? So I would say that introduce competition, both import and domestic, right? India's has also reversed. It has started increasing tariffs in a very wide range of sectors. That's not a good thing, right? So you don't want to learn everything from India, right? But there are many fundamentals which it is a very dynamic environment for the private sector. More and more entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, private young people have come onto the market, VC market, unicorns. It's very, very exciting. Get growth, get growth, okay? And a very important thing, I think India's most fundamental challenge for the next decade is creating good quality employment, right? Because we are having 8 or 10 million people coming onto the labor force every year, guaranteeing or giving good employment, not just disguised underemployment in agriculture or in peri-urban areas. That is the biggest challenge because India's enterprises are more service oriented, capital intensive. So we're not creating enough labor intensive jobs. That's a whole different seminar. It's a whole different topic, how to get more good
Right.
labor intensive jobs, right? But getting that is important, and creating the safety net, which India is doing actually brilliantly because of its mastery of the digital infrastructure. It is actually doing the safety net part is doing very well. Some people would say doing it too well. It's
Right.
what called the new welfareism. It has been done very
Makes sense. I want to wrap this up. I just want to ask you one last question. It's a macro question, but on a short enough timeline. Again, we saw the Asian financial crisis. It's the global financial system is so well entrenched that a spark in the US tends to create reactions all across the world. We saw that in '08 as well. And so we saw that in 22, with the inflation rising and the Fed interest rate increasing, a lot of stress was put into a lot of these developing nations who had bad books. We're also now seeing that there's a reversal happening where China, introduced a lot of liquidity very recently into the markets. US is aggressively reducing interest rates, and so we're potentially going towards a again a money printing, money in circulation increase. cost of money reducing cycle. And so for a lot of developing or underdeveloped countries, they don't really know what's going on. And again, if you look at the Middle East, if you look at Europe, they're very well entrenched. They project accordingly, they deal accordingly. For a lot of countries like Pakistan, we're just so focused inwards, we don't really understand how macro international financial systems impact us. And so I want to get a sense of, we saw the 22, 23, 24 cycle where the stress came in and things were extremely difficult. Do you think now, with a potential reversal and easing up of the cost of capital and more money entering the market, there is going to be some sort of space for countries like Pakistan to breathe a little?
The short answer is no. I think debt is there are now the world has accepted more spending. There are elevated levels of debt that are, the post-COVID, in a sense, almost a consensus is that significantly higher levels of debt have become the norm for the world. Unfortunately, this can be handled better by the non-poor countries, right? So emerging markets and the developed world. I think they have better management, better fiscal space to handle this. And I think there are so many new needs in the world, right? So one is to prepare for pandemics. Also, better educate your people, health and education.
Climate change.
They require huge investments, right? There are challenges of AI, right? There's climate change, right? Industrial policy. Can you mimic the trillions that that US is spending on industrial policy? No, you cannot, and you should not even go there. Right? But that's where so I think emerging the poor countries, the least developed and poor countries, have a very difficult task ahead of them, and therefore it requires more than ever a reversion to fundamentals and to create a fiscal space for all these eventualities. Not to mention taking care of current problems, right? All these current problems that we talked about, right? So I think it makes looking at the forward scenario, I think it makes it more imperative than ever to go back to fundamentals and including restructure debt, pay attention to economics 101, all these things that we talked about. Otherwise, it's going to be a tough future with the whole world spending more and challenges mounting globally.
Makes sense. Dr. Sanjay, I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to ask you one last question. You are an Asian at the end of the day, even if you live in the US. And so we're hearing a lot about this being Asia's century, notwithstanding the political crisis here and there. I hope they get sorted out soon enough. But in a long enough timeline, let's say 2050, 2075, how do you see Asia? What's the image of Asia that you get, let's say 20, 30 years from now? Does it look similar or does it look radically different? Once a lot of these countries have stuff sorted out and are able to usher in potentially, hopefully, an age of collaboration rather than competition.
Right. I'm very much an Asian, in fact, a South Asian. मेरी माता जी रावलपिंडी में पैदा हुई. My father was from Dera Ismail Khan.
Really? Zabardast.
Yeah. And I lived for 3 years in Bangladesh. And in the World Bank, this was my most passionate, my most fruitful and fun period of my time at the World Bank was working on South Asia. So very much a South Asian without a hyphen, as they say. I very much look for one South Asia non-hyphenated. And I do believe the economic forces are inexorably going back to what they were, a few hundred years ago, right? It is going back to Asia, coming back the two giants, to India and China, but also not just them. It's Japan and South Korea and so many others, right? Indonesia. So I think it is going to be an Asian century. If it was a collaborative one, it would be a better for all people in the world without geo-economic fragmentation. Hopefully, that is the only part that it doesn't spill over into other kinds of conflict, that we confine ourselves to economic conflict, and hopefully even this people see that it is not productive and it is not useful for anybody, right? These US-China wars, trade wars, which are creating a geo-economic fragmented world, which is not good for the people of the world and for Asia. But yes, I think the rise of Asia, it has already happened, but continued rise and greater share of world GDP, greater and greater share of incremental world GDP. I think nothing can stop that.
Makes sense, sir. Thank you so much for taking the time out and sharing all that insight. I मेरे बहुत सारे सवाल आंसर हुए हैं, होप बाकी लोगों के भी हुए होंगे. Thank you so much.
थैंक यू, और मुझे बुलाने के लिए बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया.
And for all of you guys, thank you so much for watching. अगर आपको एपिसोड पसंद आई और दोस्तों के साथ जरूर शेयर करिएगा. Let me know in the comment section below what are your thoughts on Pakistan's economy. I know न्यूज़ के ऊपर ईजिंग की खबर आना शुरू हो गई है. अब फाइनली स्टेबिलिटी आ गई है. इंटरेस्ट रेट भी कम हो गया है. इन्फ्लेशन भी कम हो गई है. A lot of the finance capitalist bros are gonna tell you कि भाई अब तो जो है ना pump cycle आने वाला है. लेकिन really fundamentally, what do you think about the Pakistani economy, and particularly when it comes to debt sustainability? What are your thoughts? Do you think कि restructuring honi chahiye? Does it make sense? I would love to read your comments in the comment section below. But anyways, this was Muzamil Hasan Zaidi. You were watching Thought Behind Things. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.